By the Fire presents A Desperate Soul by Dave Smale. Read for you by the author. Chapter 7. Jacob waited, hunched with his head in his cupped hands. He wasn't quite sure for what, or for whom he was waiting. As he lingered, his thoughts swirled in a mix of questions, both practical and hysterical. What am I going to do? Where do I go now? Will I be homeless? Oh no, am I going to die? His thoughts churned in an endless loop while his hands, arms, and shoulders trembled, feet incessantly tapping the floor. A strange noise registered with him. A distant, deep laugh or a growl. He paid it little attention. Surely his uncontrollable nerves were causing him to hear things, he decided. A hand touched his shoulder. He jolted. "Jacob, I'm so sorry." It was Dr. Pollock. Jacob cursed and put his head back in his hands. "Listen, everything is going to be all right," the doctor said. "You can stay here as long as you like. When you're ready, you can pick up your grandma's personal effects from the front desk and go home." "I don't have a home," Jacob interrupted. Yes you do. Look, I'll take the liberty to tell you that as her sole beneficiary, her house is now yours. At least until you talk to a lawyer. The staff here will contact the funeral home of your choice. Everything else you can do from home." The doctor held two pamphlets in front of his face so he could see their titles. One was, "My Loved One Is Gone, What Do I Do Now?" The other was called, "Coping with the Loss of Your Loved One." He didn't reach for either, and Dr. Pollock took the hint. "I'll just set these here in case—" "What's a DNR?" Jacob interrupted. "Come again?" "You said she's got a DNR. What's that?" "It means do not resuscitate. It's a medical document she signed. It was in her hospital record, and it's common for people in her condition. They're in so much pain that they choose not to prolong it. She fought hard. And, like I said, I think she waited for you before she passed. Anyway, don't forget to gather her things before you leave." As the doctor walked away, Jacob thought he heard another noise like the one he'd heard moments ago. A deep groan or a growl. This time it was accompanied by something metallic, like the clinking of thick chains. He swept his eyes over the immediate surroundings, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Jacob waited another 10 minutes, long enough to summon enough strength to go home. While he wallowed, someone had set a cardboard box with Tilda's personal effects on the empty seat next to him. He hadn't acknowledged whoever had left it. Jacob peered into the box. All she brought was her purse, he thought. That was just like her, traveling light. She never needed much. The memories threatened to plunge him back into tears. He stifled them. Jacob lifted the purse from the box. He was not about to carry a purse around town, no matter how awful he felt. He rummaged through the contents. A small makeup pouch, a pack of chewing gum, her pocketbook, an ancient flip cell phone, reading glasses, and a mini Bible. Jacob removed the pocketbook and the flip phone. He emptied her cash, coins, ID, and bank card into his pockets. Everything else was tossed in the waiting room's trash can. Jacob donned his hood, his purple hair jutting out. He stared at the floor as he moped through the halls and, finally, out the automatic front doors. He turned for the bus stop and paused, remembering how painfully long it had taken to get there via public transportation. He opted to walk home instead. Sure, it would take more effort and probably more time, but he had nothing else to do and nowhere else to... There was that noise again. The growl and the chain clink. He looked up. The high noon sun nearly blinded him. Putting a hand up to shield his eyes, he scanned the parking lot. Everything looked normal. Jacob did a double take. 50 yards to his left, a man was walking through the parking lot with... Jacob squinted. What in the... He stared for several beats, unable to process what he was seeing. Was he hallucinating? No, couldn't be. He'd been sober for at least 24 hours. Well, maybe less, he admitted to himself. He focused his gaze on the man walking through the lot. Behind the man walked two massive creatures, unlike anything Jacob had ever seen. They weren't like bears or gorillas or Sasquatches. In fact, they weren't animal-like at all. More like gigantic humans. Whatever they were, they easily stood 9 or 10 feet tall. And though they were 50 yards off, it was obvious they were hideous. With legs like oak tree trunks and arms the size of a grizzly bear's, the hairless things appeared to be covered in soot, as if they'd just crawled from a chimney. Each wore leather-bound, rust-colored body armor and had a sheathed sword strapped to its waist. Broken bone stubs protruded from their backs like compound fractures. The stubs had something stuck to them, charred remains of what looked like feathers, Jacob thought. The horrific creatures walked upright like humans. Each grasped large chains with their massive gloved hands, which attached to the man at the nape of the neck. The things made loud grunting noises at one another, conversing in a language Jacob couldn't understand. They seemed to be laughing as they followed the man, holding him by chains like a leash. Instantly, Jacob filled with terror. The sliding doors of the hospital's main entrance opened behind him. Fixated by the monsters, Jacob didn't turn around. A man passed at his right. Jacob's mind barely registered growling right next to him. He turned his head in time to see a stout chain disappearing into the base of the man's skull. Before Jacob could focus on it any more, he realized he was eye to elbow with the grotesque, soot-covered, pig-like skin of another one of the giant things. His eyes widened as he looked up, gasping. The man heard him and turned to look at him. Suddenly, the huge thing spoke. "Don't look at him," it said in a human-like voice. "He's probably on drugs." The man sneered at Jacob, whipping his head around. The giant thing passed by without acknowledging him, and somehow switched from a human voice back to its own, emitting a sinister, guttural laugh. Jacob tried to catch a glimpse of the thing's face, but was only able to see the back of its filthy neck under its rusty helmet. Close by, a car door shut, diverting Jacob's attention. In his peripheral, another of the monsters walked behind a woman heading toward him. He dared to look at the thing's face, at least the part that wasn't partially obscured by a helmet. It was almost human. He could make out eyes, a nose, ears, and a mouth like a man's. However, its jaw was badly oversized, even deformed, and its eyes filled the sockets like black pools. With their old rusty armor and filthy skin, the monsters reminded Jacob of medieval executioners, only much, much larger and infinitely more terrifying. As the woman with the attached monster approached, she glanced at Jacob for a moment. Her eyes met his. He guessed her to be in her mid-40s. She looked like an average, everyday person, perhaps visiting a sick relative. "Don't look at him! He might be dangerous!" the monster screeched in a distinctly female voice. The woman quickly averted her eyes from Jacob's. Jacob looked up at the monster. The monstrosity locked eyes with him. Instantly, he filled to the brim with fear. The thing seemed to radiate and transmit evil with its oil puddle eyes. It growled and then grinned at him, the most sinister grin imaginable. Its teeth were dark orange, as if stained by blood. Worse yet, the thing seemed to be able to look directly into his mind. Already rattled to the core from the day's events, Jacob reached a breaking point. He screamed as the monster's wicked smile drove him into a panic. The woman turned to look at him, but he didn't notice, having broken into a full sprint through the parking lot. Jacob weaved through the cars and continued onto the boulevard, never slowing down. The wind swept his hood off his head, hair whipping behind him. He had not run like this in years. When Jacob stepped onto Virginia Beach Boulevard, he pulled up short and took in the scene. The giants were everywhere. There were hundreds, no, thousands of them, perhaps tens of thousands. Jacob watched as the things walked behind cars, effortlessly keeping pace with them while holding chains affixed to the drivers and passengers. Their grunts and evil laughs were cumulatively louder than the noise of the midday traffic. At that point, Jacob knew he must be hallucinating. He ducked behind a close-by dumpster, panting from the combination of sprinting and panic. He shut his eyes, hoping that this insanity would end as soon as he opened them. The monsters were deafening. He cupped his ears, but it didn't help. The sounds of the traffic were muffled, but the sounds of the monsters were not. "Shut up!" he shouted in desperation. "Shut up!" But there was no change. The monstrosities carried on, as if they hadn't heard him, or didn't care. "I've got to get home," he thought. The thought of Grandma Tilda's house brought temporary comfort, despite her death being so recent. However, there were several miles between here and her house. How would he get there without being seen? Would the bus be safe? He doubted it. A bus would be no challenge to the monsters if they could keep up with cars. "I'll just look at the ground and walk. Try to ignore them. Maybe they won't notice me." He put his hood up again and crept from behind the dumpster. As soon as he stepped out, the monsters grunted noticeably louder than before. Alarmed, he dove back behind the dumpster, his heart racing. Had he been seen? Were they coming for him? A minute passed, and no creatures happened upon him. Instead, they continued grunting loudly. Jacob caught his breath and chanced to peek around the dumpster. All the giants were looking skyward, bellowing in their garbled language. What were they looking at? He followed their eyes to the sky, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Then he heard something in the background, a familiar sound. It was a jet, which in Virginia Beach was not odd, being so close to Naval Air Station Oceana. "They don't like airplanes? That's weird." The jet noise increased. Jacob looked up, expecting to see an FA-18 pass overhead en route to Oceana. But he didn't see an airplane. Instead, it looked like... No, it couldn't be. A man was flying only a few hundred feet above him. Jacob only caught a glimpse of it due to its intense speed. From what he could see, the man had 6 enormous wings. It was wearing all white, which made him look like a white streak. The flying man disappeared in the distance, heading toward Virginia Beach's downtown area, known as Town Center. What on earth just happened? The beast things didn't like him, whoever he was. Now that he'd passed, they resumed their activities, and, gurgling, Jacob decided to try and ignore the monsters as he walked back to Tilda's house. It was now his house, but at the moment, that thought did not bring much comfort.
Hey, it's Jacob. I'm not a real rock star, but I might loosely be based on the author, who's also not a rock star. Hey, I just wanted to take a couple of minutes and tell you about Anchor. If you haven't heard about it, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain. First off, it's free. Also, there's creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast, like right from your phone or computer. Anchor will distribute your podcast so it can be heard on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and many more. You can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership, and it's everything you need to make a podcast all in one place. So download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm right now to get started.
You've been listening to By the Fire. Hey, tell us what you think. Leave us a review on Apple, Spotify, Google, or wherever you download your podcasts. Or send me an email. info@davesmale.com. info@davesmale.com. Thank you so much for listening. This is a work of fiction. Names, characters, businesses, places, events, and incidents are either the products of the author's imagination or used in a fictitious manner. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental.